right, everybody, we're going to go ahead and kick off this session. So thank you, everybody, for making it here today. We really appreciate it. My name is Bella Grabowski. I'm campaign director for Sovereign America and Strong America at AFPI. So I cover mostly defense, foreign policy, and immigration issues. And once again, thank you for joining us on the panel today. This is the Northern Frontier Great Powers of the Arctic panel. And joining me today, we have Chuck DeVore, the Chief National Initiatives Officer at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Next to him is Rear Admiral Peter Brown, who's Senior Fellow focused on Western Hemisphere security and maritime affairs. We also have Colonel Barry Leonard, who is part of the Royal Canadian Air Force and is the Air and Space Attaché in the Embassy of Canada, and Eric Laporte, who is Executive Director of the Security and Defense Relations Division at Global Affairs Canada. So to begin, I guess I'll kind of set the stage of what we're going to be talking about. So the Arctic is no longer a remote frontier. It is a strategic domain for missile warning, maritime access, and the great power competition. What happens in the Arctic directly impacts homeland defense, North American security, and global stability. The core question is simple. Can the United States and Canada and the allies that support them be credible and integrated, could come up with a credible and integrated Arctic strategy, and are we moving too fast? Are we moving fast enough to compete with Russia and China? So I guess I'll kick it off and go down the line of what you think the biggest or the single biggest Arctic security challenge is right now.
Wow, the single biggest. Well, I'm pretty sure we're going to hear about more conventional threats as we move down the line with this panel. But let me say that I think this hybrid warfare challenge that we face, where you have weak to non-existent rule of law, you have a lot of communities that are very impoverished, that may be enticed by either bribes or promises of big investments, or quick, easy money through drug transit. And so I should think that one of the big challenges that we have is how do we preserve North America for North Americans, and how do we keep unwanted malign influences from penetrating further into our mutual sphere of interest, and what are the practical things that we can do to try to prevent that?
And I think you're right on there, Chuck. And I think one of the other challenges that the Arctic presents is, for a long time it was seen as kind of an inaccessible area suitable only for rugged exploration and treated as something of a global commons, where those explorers, mostly European and North American, would abide by the same set of rules, provide mutual support to one another when something went wrong. And what we're seeing now is, as there's competition for routes, for resources, and when we say resources, we think oil, gas, maybe minerals, but also protein, meaning fish biomass in the Arctic. That treatment as a global commons no longer works. And the idea that the rules-based international order is going to preserve order there is to me, it's the Maginot Line of the 21st century. That rules-based international order is being exploited on a daily basis in a multitude of different ways by our competitors, and only by working together will we identify, deter, and apply consequences to them.
It's interesting. Rules are only as good as those who follow them, right? I would say probably the biggest challenge in the Arctic is domain awareness. It's about knowing what's going on up there, so that way you can do something about it. That's really the fundamental piece. We talk often about engagement with Russia in the Arctic. NORAD is deeply familiar with that. China kind of certainly highlighting itself as an Arctic interested nation, or whatever language that they're using these days. And of course, the traditional threats that are associated with coming over top of the pole. The worst case scenarios when you're talking about ballistic missiles and the like, but also the approaches from the west and from the east. The fact that, of course, the Arctic is melting at a rate that's a lot greater than temperature changes that we're seeing across the planet, and so that makes avenues of approach that much more significant for our adversaries and their ability to be able to reach it. So when you're talking about domain awareness, if you've got a geography that's so large that's an archipelago that is not densely populated, you need a lot of activity, you need a lot of assets to be able to provide that knowledge of what's going on, so then you know how to target those people or those things, those activities that are in those areas, and you know what to do about them. Our defense policy is definitely going after that. It's on the label, Our North, Strong and Free. That's one of the great things about our defense policy. It kind of speaks exactly what it's going to do. So priority one is the Arctic, and that's why it's a challenge.
Yeah, lots to build on there. Just echoing Colonel here, domain awareness in the traditional sense, as we talked about, but I also agree with Chuck and the Rear Admiral, domain awareness, but also what's going on, including kind of in the economic sphere and the hybrid sphere, and sort of ensuring that we know what's happening in that respect. So things like, the Investment Canada Act sort of really sort of following through on what's being invested by other actors and understanding what's behind it. But like we've seen, Russia remains the greatest military threat. China has the potential to be a significant disruptor across economic, scientific, and military domains, and we're seeing that. And I think, in addition to everything that our colleagues at National Defense are doing, there's a lot of work going on, or will be a lot of work going on in terms of building the economic resilience of sort of our northern communities, and to make sure that they're not sort of swayed by foreign actors. And so, we talked about national security in kind of the traditional terms, but when we engage with northerners, their aspect of security is kind of food security, health, access to education, healthcare, and all those things. And those are things that need to sort of be built up to ensure the security broadly, in addition to kind of the conventional security aspects.
No, those are all like great themes. I wrote down, domain awareness was talked about quite a bit. Sovereignty kind of like wasn't talked about directly, but kind of hit on some of those points. But I did want to go back to domain awareness and ask, what is, and I'll turn to our Canadian friends. So in your mind, what do you think is like the biggest, I guess, something that Americans underestimate about the Arctic, like from your perspective? And then I'll ask the same.
I wouldn't just put Americans in this. I would say even Canadians. I mean, the vast majority of Canadians live in the southern portions of Canada. So even our appreciation of the vast extent, the scale of our Arctic, of Canada's Arctic, is really unknown. I mean, a great example is there's an operation that the Air Force conducts, Operation Box Top, where we do resupply for for the world's most northerly, persistently inhabited station, CFS, Canadian Forces Station Alert, and so we do resupply to that, and they typically come out of southern Ontario. To get halfway for that resupply, they go to Baffin Island, and Baffin Island, from a Canadian's perspective, that's the high north, and it's not. It's only about halfway to get there. It's incredible when you think about that. There's lots of stats that we throw out. We say 40%, 40% of the land mass, 70 to 75% of our coastline. It's big space. It's an archipelago, and so the scale of the environment is immense, absolutely immense, and the ability to be able to cross that environment is immense. The ability for us to build out infrastructure in those areas is incredibly challenging, because you're sitting on top of frozen tundra. You're sitting on top of all sorts of spaces that you can only develop in certain parts of the time. And so then the challenge then, if you're looking at scale and the speed at which that environment is changing and the speed at which adversaries are considering exploitation in those areas, how do you persist? How do you maintain persistence in that environment to be a credible deterrent? Those are the things that I think we collectively underestimate.
Maybe I can add just a few. Completely agree. I mean, I had scale as the issue. I mean, just size-wise, the Canadian Arctic is 1.7 million square miles. That's about 6.5 times the size of Texas, 4 times the size of Alaska. So it is vast, but it's also incredibly inhospitable terrain. Very difficult to move around. That's why there's very few roads, because you can't navigate through with roads. It's also an archipelago. So getting there, the navigation season is short. So there's a saying that, everything that you do, there's a rule of 4. It takes 4 times as long and costs 4 times more to do it. And things must be adapted to the conditions. It's not just working in the north, it's working in the Arctic. how do you adapt your radios, your fuel, your batteries, your lubricants to be able to function in those environments? How do you fire your rifle with MITs? Things like that, right? So those are the things we kind of underestimate. And the building and delivery cycle for getting sort of big, heavy kit upstairs, again, it's a very limited navigation window to bring stuff in. And if you forget something, then you got to wait another sort of year or a season before you can actually get it in.
Turn this question over back to you, Eric. From the Canadian government's perspective, what's driving Arctic policy? Is it continental defense? Is it the political pressure? Is it just, defense needs to be re-upped and it's time? So,
I mean, I think I would say all of the above, really. You've highlighted a mix of issues to consider. I think for a long time, and as mentioned, it was a zone that is inaccessible, fairly safe, 3 oceans, far away, inaccessible, safe and secure environment. But we're realizing that the threat environment has changed, and so we need to sort of take charge of that. So at a fundamental level, it's also about ensuring that the Canadians, the Northerners, the Indigenous people that are there, who live in the Arctic, they are on the front line, and they need to be of this rapidly changing environment. And the defense investments that are going forward are one to sort of bring up that national defense security investment forward, all those capabilities, but some of it is also to build resilience in communities. And so, for example, you expand a runway, make it bigger, then bigger aircraft can come in, they can bring more goods. So then it's easier for that community to sustain itself. So there's some dual use purposes in there that are also driving Canadian policy on this.
Do you see a role that the U.S. or some other allies could play in that investment? I kind of could turn it over to anyone, because Canada has announced record defense spending, or their desire to do so, and so has the United States. So I just would like to hear some thoughts on that as well.
Well, I should certainly think that the U.S. Would be wise to look to, for example, Canadian innovation when it comes to things like hybrid drones, for example, that are designed to work in harsh temperature conditions and have longer range because they have on board, a petrochemical fuel source. That's an example of something where I think the Canadians could very easily lead and essentially relieve the U.S. of the burden of designing and producing that sort of a tool. I think there's all kinds of things when it comes to Arctic warfare and surveillance that in a relatively limited defense procurement budget, it would make sense for the Canadians to specialize in that and then potentially sell it not only to the U.S., but to the Norwegians or the Swedes or the Finns. I think that would probably be something that we would look upon very as an astute move from Canada's standpoint.
And then I would add that because of the unique relationship of the U.S. and Canada in NORAD, that could be leveraged to improve our space-based surveillance capabilities. And it's great that we actually have an Air and Space Force attaché here, because even maritime domain awareness, what the U.S. Coast Guard is looking for, really at this point now in the Arctic needs to go from the seabed to space, because with the extended continental shelf claims of the Arctic nations, virtually every square mile, kilometer, however you want to measure it, of the Arctic Ocean seabed is now claimed as extended continental shelf by one or more than one of the Arctic nations. And so that surveillance of the seabed, the water column, the water surface, the ice pack, the ice-shore interactions, the atmosphere and space, that there needs to be a continuum of knowledge there that's shared between the U.S. and Canada, and NORAD is probably a good facility to do that. As NATO partners, we're looking for a 5% contribution, 3.5% in traditional security, 1.5% in other. And so maybe this kind of specialization that Chuck mentioned, where Canada has companies, industry, and experience in the very specialized capabilities that are needed to operate in the high north, maybe they skew their investment in that direction, while the U.S. and others skew in more conventional forces that are more applicable in the lower latitudes.
We touched on NORAD a little bit in the last panel that I was moderating on Canada, but could you go over a little bit in front of this audience, just NORAD and what that looks like, and I guess going forward now with NORAD modernization and how the U.S. could play a role, and I'll turn it over to you, Admiral Brown, and also you, Colonel Leonard.
Okay, yeah. So NORAD, the binational defense consortium cooperative that's based in Colorado Springs, is a U.S., Canada, it's a product of the Cold War, but its viability continues well beyond the Cold War. As mentioned, the hybrid threats and the availability now of missile technology to actors beyond the traditional Russia was the problem, China, North Korea, even Iran, those over-the-pole orbits can very quickly access the population centers of North America and Europe, and so it's absolutely vital. And one of the Trump administration moves regarding Greenland to bring Greenland into the NORTHCOM and NORAD area of operations rather than the European Command area of operations was done to actually strengthen our ability to have that space domain, air and space domain awareness over the poles and over the Arctic.
Yeah, I think some of the history behind NORAD is fascinating. General Coates kind of highlighted it a little bit in the last panel as well when he's talking about the Ogdenburg agreements in New York, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt and William Lyon Mackenzie King, our prime minister at the time, decided to get together behind closed doors and just have an unvetted, unscripted kind of conversation about how do you defend North America and how does that work. And through that, they created the Ogdensburg Agreement, and following that, these multiple it turned into annual kind of meetings, the joint boards of defense, PJBD is what they call them, and so there's we have had about 300 of those between Canada and the United States bilaterally, where we talk about exactly how do you do this. And that was essentially the impetus behind the creation of NORAD, which has been in existence, I think, for almost 58 years or so. I'm almost a little nervous speaking about it right now, given the fact we've got an expert in the audience. But what's so neat about it is that it traditionally was designed, like the Admiral had said, it was about the northern approaches and making sure that you could prevent, essentially the Russian bear from bringing a long-range attack in over top of Canada and to attack the United States, and of course consequentially with Canada. And so that remains extant. However, with respect to space-based assets and the advancements of ballistic missiles, which no longer follow hyperbolic trajectories that you can mathematically calculate, the approaches are no longer Arctic. The approaches are now west, east. They're all around the clock. They're down south as well. And so what could be interpreted as a standard satellite launch from another part of the country, it may not carry satellites. It might carry something that can just orbit the Earth and then come on down whenever it needs to. And so that holds you at threat. And so the whole modernization, this is the point. The whole point about NORAD modernization is about looking at the current environment and the forecasted environment, which is manifesting, and finding ways for us to be able to provide a credible deterrent to our adversaries through the NORAD institution, the NORAD organization, the command, so that way they understand that today's not the day. I think the neatest part about NORAD, and we say it a lot, but it really is actually quite important, it is the world's only binational command. So like, there's no two countries in the world, no other two countries in the world who actually entrust in another country their members and their forces to be able to have the responsibility for part of the defense of their own country. Like a Canadian, for example, was the one who shut down American airspace post 9/11. That's amazing to think about that. The amount of trust that's required at the operational, the tactical, and strategic level inside the militaries, so that way we can operate together to defend our continent collectively.
I guess that kind of goes with some of the other themes you talked about in the other panel about just like the difference between the political side and the defense side and the relationships. And I'll ask the same question here too to hear your perspectives, but I'd love to hear, how do you think that each country respectfully should, approach the situation that we have right now, and what's the path forward? What does that look like, especially with NORAD modernization and those partnerships and the current environment that we're dealing with our adversaries too?
So you're talking mostly a political military question now, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess this is the time when we get to be extra diplomatic with ourselves and with the audience. It seems to me that that the facts on the ground don't change right now regarding whether or not the occupant of the White House changes. The facts on the ground are what they are. And the fact is that, of course, we've had a pretty significant holiday from reality, from history, for a couple of decades after the end of the Cold War. And there's a lot of catching up to do. And different nations are looking at this catching up more seriously than others. And I know that Canada is beginning to accelerate, but it's from an extremely low floor. And I currently, I doubt that there is political will to do much more than is currently being anticipated, which is one of the reasons why I mentioned previously the specialization, the thought of, if you are going to develop force structure and have investments, it really ought to be in areas that are very unique and really accentuate the specialized advantage that the Canadians would have. I think that regardless of any sort of near-term ramifications of President Trump's criticisms of Canada or Prime Minister Carney's apparent warming up to the People's Republic of China, the bottom line is that China's predatory capitalistic mercantilistic model is not going to allow any significant importation of Canadian finished goods other than for the purpose of ripping them off from intellectual property standpoint. Certainly they'll welcome raw material, but that's not going to necessarily sustain the Canadian standard of living. So I would hope that at some point, as reality begins to set in, we can resume a very vigorous, mutually beneficial relationship. I think it's inevitable, but certainly political egos are a thing, something I learned from my time in elected office, and sometimes they can prevent people from doing wise actions that benefit their constituency. So we'll see. We'll see.
I'd like to salute a wise action that the government of Canada took relatively recently, which was moving its Coast Guard from a purely civilian agency to within the Ministry of Defense to make it a national security component, recognizing that maritime domain awareness and presence is vital to national security and sovereignty. And then I would say that another area of substantial cooperation is the recent ICE Pact collaborative deal or contract with the U.S., Canada, and Finland to not only build icebreaking vessels faster than any one nation could do it alone, but also to help develop within Canada and within the United States both the shipyard capability and the workforce competency to continue to build those icebreaking vessels in the near future. To paraphrase the old saying, the best time to plant a tree was a couple decades ago. The best time to build an icebreaker was a couple decades ago. The second best time to do it is right now. And in Finland, they're already cutting steel on the first Canadian version of this icebreaker class, with U.S. Coast Guard ones to follow relatively soon, aiming for delivery in 2028. For the first probably two of a class of 4 with follow-on to be built in the United States in partnership with Davie Shipbuilding from Canada. And so that's a substantial move forward. I've in a previous job at Coast Guard U.S. Coast Guard headquarters about 10 years ago, got called over to the Pentagon to discuss doing a freedom of navigation operation above the Northern Sea Route, challenging a Russian extraterritorial claim. And basically they asked, so when can we do this? We want you, and we want a Coast Guard icebreaker to escort a destroyer to go up there and do this thing. I'm like, I can give you 3 weeks next August because we're so limited in capability and capacity. And so we need to do better than that. We need real presence. You know, we say we have an exclusive economic zone. The fact of the matter is, around most parts of Alaska and the U.S. Arctic, we literally can't exclude anybody in terms of a surface vessel without, without going southern spear, or call it northern spear, on them. So there needs to be some continuum of capability that we just don't have yet.
Well, let's not be so hasty to exclude kinetic action.
Okay.
Maybe I can just jump in on, a little bit to Chuck's earlier point of sort of our two countries sort of sharing the continent. And I agree, geography matters. We are on top of North America together. And, the relationship has been so strong and is strong. I mean, we recognize that the U.S. is a key, if not the key security partner for us, key economic partner for us. And Colonel Belnall talked about sort of on the military side how great that cooperation is. And I think that's true, and that's going to continue. I think what we're seeing, though, you talked about engagement with China. I mean, some of that is a reflection of the dynamics down here, where you have a president and administration that is looking to also block or prevent Canadian goods to come into the U.S. So we have to find other markets, but at the end of the day, we will remain fully locked in as a strategic ally with the U.S. That is our destiny as sort of custodians of the same shared continent. And geography will matter. And for decades, we've been friends, partners, allies, and I'm confident that will continue.
Need, knowledge, and capacity. IcePact is such a great example of that. You've got a Canadian shipyard that's got stuff that's got a setup over in Finland, bringing in European expertise on that, developing something that is absolutely necessary in the United States, and then you got a partnership between three nations to be able to do that. I think it's such a great storyline. On will, I think there's will. I think that you were talking about the cost and about spending, and you said you weren't sure if there's will. I think there is will to continue to accelerate. No, I don't think. I know for a fact that there is will to continue accelerating the spending on defense and for us to be able to step up to the plate. I think you are accurate in, and I think it's a fair statement to say that that over the course of the past couple of decades, we have underinvested, and it's going to take us a while to get up to that. You're right, so I appreciate those two comments for sure. The willpower for us to be able to move ahead, it's there. The fact that, you guys are increasing defense spending from $1 trillion to 1.5, right? That just the proposal, anyways, just came through, and so last year we increased our defense spending by 35%. So you're at 50% proposed. We did 35% last year in 3 quarters. 3 quarters, not even in a year. And so the fact that we did that last year, I think, is pretty amazing. 2%, yeah, it's a floor. Totally agree. 100% not celebrating. Happy the fact that we're there. We're not celebrating that. Are we moving ahead? Absolutely. Are we continuing on top of that 2%? We're already doing that because we're into our new fiscal.
Yeah, I actually wanted to touch base again on we talked a little bit about adversaries in the hemisphere up there. We mentioned allies too, but I want to hit back on that point. Canada and the United States are the only players there. We have NATO partners as well, as we saw with Greenland. So yeah, I would just like to hear your perspectives on what you think the new, or what should be the security architecture up north, and who the players should be, who should be involved, if anyone, on the other side.
Well, I guess I can kick it off a little bit. Security architecture. Well, we could start with infrastructure, I suppose, because we're tackling that at the moment. We've got northern operational support hubs established, and we're in the process of establishing northern operational support nodes from which you could kind of like project forward, and that means from the dual use that Eric's talking about, is going to be super useful for our communities, because you're hardening runways, you're lengthening runways, you're providing hangar space for munitions and for individuals and for people from which they can actually forward operate. And so that's awesome. That's going to support not just things like resupply, like Operation Box Top, like I told you about, but that will also reconstitute and provide reinforcing backstops for Operation Nanook, which is a persistent military operation for the defense of the Arctic. So there's a lot of things in there that I think are really useful, and those are already underway. Some of that stuff's a part of NORAD modernization. OTHR is another great idea. Over the horizon radar. We're still waiting for the Americans actually to figure out what they're doing on the west side, but we've moved ahead on that. Sorry, I've got a plug in on that one for you guys. But we've already moving ahead on that on the east side, and so the great part about that for over the horizon radar, in terms of understanding what's coming into the northern approach and the eastern approach, also covers the DMV. So that's part of our responsibility to do that for you, and so I think that's some good collaborative stuff there.
I'd like to see more collaboration dealing with the gray zone threat. And as part of that, I think there needs to be some serious look at enabling statute. Of course, here in the U.S., we have something called the Bill of Rights that we need to be very mindful of. And you're seeing that, of course, with some of the discussion over FISA reauthorization. Nevertheless, we can't allow procedural adherence to what has been norms in the past to be a suicide pact, and to ignore the massive advances in technology and artificial intelligence, and in the way our adversaries specifically set out to exploit our weaknesses. And I think you're seeing that especially so in Canada, and especially so in British Columbia, an area that I know a little bit about. I was born in Seattle, and my great-grandfather prospected in Ainsworth, which is actually named after a relative of my family on Kootenai Lake. I guess I could say after that. The challenge is that we have a nation in the People's Republic of China that is using lawfare very aggressively to go after its critics and to make the political class more malleable to Chinese strategic interests. And so what I would like to see isn't simply the sharing of information in intelligence fusion areas, but then a feedback loop to policymakers who are in the elected class saying, hey, this is what's going on. Here's where we perhaps need additional appropriations, and we may need some new legal authority to be able to go after some of this stuff effectively, because we oughtn't to forget that for our adversaries, they see warfare as a far more creative spectrum than do we traditionally, where we think of mostly or exclusively kinetic terms to point the criticism back at me after I made the kinetic comment with Northern Spear.
No, those are some great comments, and it plays into this idea that I think our European Arctic nations also have a significant role to play here. And one of the challenges that we have is that they are have become so high-level warfare averse that security and sovereignty they sometimes have a little bit of a hard time with. So we have to find a way to talk about those gray zone conflicts, those activities short of kinetic warfare that our adversaries are taking, including the commercial ones, basically the toll system for the Northern Sea Route that Russia is trying to apply to what is an international waterway in every possible way. And one of the other things to think about is the way that I talk to folks about the activities of the People's Republic of China and the companies that operate under their guidance and auspices is that research leads to robbery. It's basically the equivalent of a police officer patrolling your neighborhood but looking in your windows to see what he can come back later and steal. Why would we want that? Investment leads to infiltration. So we talk a lot about Greenland, but in Iceland, the People's Republic of China has an MOU with Iceland to learn about geothermal energy. And they are taking that back to China to figure out how to extract geothermal energy in the inlands of Mongolia and elsewhere. But at the same time, they have access to geothermal plants in Iceland. So if you think about mining of rare earth minerals or other commercially valuable ores in Greenland or in the seabed of the Arctic, refining in Iceland with Chinese labor and Chinese wages, and then selling finished product in European and North American markets, that's, in my opinion, that's one of the things that they're aiming for. They built an embassy building in Reykjavik for their 4 to 5 person embassy staff that has a capacity of 500 people. So they are there for a purpose, and they're very opaque about that purpose. And then their education arrangements, like this thing on geothermal energy and others, always, to me, they're a form of espionage, both commercial and governmental. And so making sure that our European Arctic partners are aware of that, and I think the U.S. is probably more sensitive to it than they are. And then the last thing I'd say about our European partners in particular is Norway is the closest geographic analog to Alaska. And so they have some of the same challenges by being most directly neighboring to Russia, by having Russian commercial and military activity going across the coast of Norway, and they have a similar extensive coastline of exposure. So I think there's a lot of lessons we can learn from Norway about how they've handled the threat of Russia.
Can I just jump in on that? I think this has been a very sort of useful part of the conversation. We talked about kind of investment screening and those types of things. I completely agree. Detect, deter, and defend on the kind of traditional military side. One of the things that we're doing, again, on investment screening, we're doing very, very effectively, and I think we've had some examples of really close Canada-U.S. cooperation in terms of intel sharing, where the PRC was wanting to buy a certain piece of infrastructure. We were able then to stop it. But another thing that is helpful in the context is kind of, awareness for communities, for them to be to understand kind of the potential threats. And so one of the things that we've done is we've actually sort of been able to extend security clearances to Indigenous leaders, provincial, territorial leaders, so that our intelligence services can have a some conversation about the challenges and the threats that they're seeing, so that those communities, when they're faced with a deal that looks so great, they can actually understand what's behind it. So things like that are helpful, and I know that we share some of those. Again, that part of that is driven a lot in terms of shared intelligence and how we put that forward. So I think there's lots of cooperation already going on, CAN-US side for those things.
I did want to touch on the maritime aspect of the Arctic a little bit. So I know we talked about China quite a bit, but I do want to hit on both Russia and China. So this is directed towards you, Admiral Brown. So how can you describe what China and Russia are doing in the Arctic right now?
Well, sure. We talked briefly about the Northern Sea Route. As that opens up, Russia accesses a lot of its oil and gas industry through that Northern Sea Route. They have plants on the Arctic coast. They also are doing significant military development along the Arctic coast, reviving Cold War era bases of all types, air bases, space bases, including on Wrangel Island, which is an island that the Soviets basically just took adverse possession of against the United States back in the 1920s. And the U.S. hasn't asserted a claim to it, but Russians have developed it militarily. And for commercial traffic, they require icebreaker escorts. So, and that's basically their tolling system along the Northern Sea Route. And the forecast is that as ice opens up, that route will make a trip from Asia to, say, Rotterdam faster and cheaper than going through the Straits of Malacca and the Suez Canal. And then similarly, as the ice recedes and more cartography is done of the Northwest Passage of Canada, there's a potential to go from the Bering Strait, say Japan, to Europe in a not dealing with Russia, but instead going across the U.S. and Canada. And then ultimately, if there's a true ice-free Arctic in 2050 or whatever the projections are, then a straight polar route from the Bering Strait to the coast of Western Europe is available, and it saves in some cases about 40% of the time and the sea transport expense of some of those things. So all those things are resources or routes that are being considered and studied now by our adversaries to use them to their advantage. And then similarly, China, calling itself a near-Arctic nation, at a point last summer had 5 ice-breaking vessels doing research on the U.S. extended continental shelf claim north of Alaska. And the U.S. was able to basically send somebody to watch them for a while, but we really couldn't, under international law, push them out. There weren't statutory teeth to be able to tell them to move along.
Do you think that they were reconning potential deep water basins for their strategic ballistic nuclear submarines?
Oh, they can certainly be doing that. They, like I said, they're basically looking in the windows of our water space and our seabed resources to consider how they might exploit them. And again, the Chinese and their fishing fleet has already virtually emptied the Bering Sea and the Northern Pacific. And so the Arctic Ocean is very likely to be the next, particularly if the oceans continue to warm. These very prolific and productive cold water species will have to move north, and Chinese fishing fleets will almost certainly go to the Arctic to find them.
You mentioned icebreakers a little bit too. Can we talk a little bit more about the U.S. and what our fleet looks like, and then Canada, what that kind of looks like, and then also what our adversaries have comparison?
Oh my goodness. Okay. So the graphic tally is 57 to 47, and the 57 is Russia, and the 47 is all Western nations. And so the United States has 3 Arctic-capable icebreakers. One of them is 50 years old, basically, the Polar Star, and that's used almost exclusively to go to the Antarctic because it's the only U.S. icebreaker capable of breaking out the Antarctic, the Ross Ice Shelf, to get to McMurdo Sound. And then we have 2 what we call medium icebreakers. They're Polar Class 3, and so they're capable of Arctic-level ice at most times of the year. One of them we just got, or the Coast Guard just got. It was a commercial ice-breaking vessel. And then the new class of Arctic security cutters that are being built under the Ice Pact agreement will also be kind of Arctic-specific. And then we have another class of icebreaker on the drawing boards that should be Antarctic-capable. So the ultimate goal is to get to a fleet size somewhere between 15 and 30. Which would be required for assured access and presence in both the Arctic and Antarctic basins at all times of our choosing. And these would be, Coast Guard warships with, electronic surveillance capabilities, some measure of self-defense weaponry, but certainly capable of escorting, say, Navy vessels and others up there. And then Canada has its own fleet of icebreakers. The ships are not exactly interchangeable, even if they're the same ice class, or the 2 Coast Guards don't have precisely the same authorities. And we even have some territorial disputes with Canada, such that if we wanted to do a freedom of navigation op on the Northern Sea route, we wouldn't ask Canada to join us, and they wouldn't, because the claim that we're asserting against Russia is also a claim that we have, in another part of water against Canada. So, even with nations that are as cooperative as we are,
Shots fired, Dave.
Yeah, we're not exactly interchangeable in that way.
We had some good claims with Denmark as well. We resolved that with schnapps, so maybe we could do that. Yeah, the Arctic and offshore patrol ships are a new investment for the Royal Canadian Navy. By function of the fact that I'm wearing a blue uniform that I chose because it matches the color of my eyes, means that I don't have an awful lot of detail on that. I regret. I should have better prepared for that. However, I can say that Arctic on the label, they are a class of Arctic patrol, which is exceptional for our capabilities in terms of making sure that we maintain our sovereign abilities in the Arctic. For anybody who's contesting territorial space. I just have one other there for you as well, though. But with the Coast Guard, I'm really glad that you brought that up. The fact that the Canadian Coast Guard is now under D&D, it fits inside the Department of National Defence umbrella, because that significantly increases. The capability was already there, but it significantly increases our information sharing, and the use of those assets to deliver capability in those parts of the world. So that's a huge benefit, I think, to all of us, really.
And I would add that all this discussion about sovereignty and national security, those interests don't exist for their own sake. And I think one of the huge benefits of the Trump administration's national security strategy and all its supporting documentation, including the Maritime Action Plan, which specifically addresses Arctic and icebreaker issues, is that it raises the commercial and economic flourishing of our country to the same level of importance as our military, diplomatic, and sovereignty national security concerns. In other words, national security doesn't exist for its own sake. It exists to permit the flourishing of our populations. And whether that's the northern and indigenous communities directly who are assisted by the development of dual-use infrastructure in the Arctic, or by the rest of our countries that are aided by the ability to access oil, gas, rare earth minerals, and other resources that are available in the Arctic, is the reason that we're doing this.
Can I just jump in to sort of just highlight, we're talking about icebreakers, but highlight, in addition to IcePack, kind of the cooperation that we do, and one that I highlight, the Colonel talked about Box Stop earlier. Part of Box Stop also has sort of stops in Patufic, and so a lot of the resupply that goes to Patufic goes by sea, and that is opened up through Operation Pacer Goose, which is Canadian Coast Guard providing the icebreaking capability to get to Patufic. So there again is sort of an example of sort of hand-to-hand CAN-US cooperation where we work together to each our benefit.
You brought up Patufic. I'm going to ask one more question, then we're going to turn it over to Q&A. But I did want to hit on missile warning in space and just the Arctic and its importance on that. So, Colonel Leonard, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I think the question essentially was like, is the Arctic foundational, right? Is that kind of what you're looking at? Is the Arctic foundational to missile defense?
Yes, and how it relates to missile defense in space. I just feel like people hear that all the time, and then just having an explanation of, just like not only the approaches, but just strategic, like geographic location.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I would argue it's foundational, but it's not exclusive, especially with what I highlighted earlier, with just the advents of ballistic missile defense and the various capabilities that exist now to target or hold threat the entire continent from pretty much any number of the clock, I guess, from any degree, and so definitely foundational, because it's absolutely a space. I mean, we know the capabilities that are on the other side with Russia, and so yeah, absolutely. I think what's interesting about that is the advancement of OTHR, the advancement of our ground-based radars, also the advancement of terrestrial downlink stations for the exquisite capabilities that lie within proliferated satellite constellations across the planet that are a function of U.S. capability, also a function of Canadian capability, the collaboration between those two. So there's a lot of activity that is underway for our Arctic abilities to be able to reduce latency of communication, reduce latency of information sharing, just by function of the latitude from which those downlink stations are planned to be established. So Arctic stuff is super important in that, but definitely not exclusive, given the types of threats that NORAD on a daily basis is confronted with.
I'd like to weigh in on that. I think it's really important that we not settle on a particular architecture or become too comfortable with the permanency of any sort of an architecture. If you look at the space environment and the fact that with the innovations mostly coming out of Elon Musk's SpaceX operation, we're seeing a reduction in the cost to orbit, probably, 100-fold over Cold War era, probably hitting close to 1,000-fold. And what that's going to feed into is an increasingly crowded low Earth orbit environment. And at what point, for example, might you have, I know we're talking about things like the threat of fractional orbital bombardment, for example. You didn't mention that, but you did, not by name, right?
That's right.
But what happens if there is, and I think I've got the term right, a Kessler event. Is it Kessler or Kepler?
It is Kessler syndrome, yeah.
Kessler event, where either intentionally triggered by the Chinese or the Russians or inadvertently triggered, what then does that do to any sort of space-based architecture we have? Which then reinforces the over-the-horizon radar efforts that you're doing to the east. Certainly, pardon me, would reinforce any efforts that we would do in the west, including with Hawaii and other U.S. territories, because you can't rely on simply a space-based architecture. It's great. I think even more important, or as important, is the fusion of all of the different arrays and sources of information, not only for situational awareness, but for targeting data, so that we can maintain a credible deterrence.
Yeah, and as you said, a space-based or a polar Arctic-based warning system is essential, but it's not everything. It's a component of a layer of systems that have to account not only for the available technology, but also the very challenging, not only the terrestrial, the meteorological weather, but also the space weather and the electromagnetic anomalies that occur in the high Arctic that render kind of traditional communications very vulnerable and always at the worst possible time.
On that note.
Couldn't agree more.
But I thought the Northern Lights were pretty.
They are, until you have to talk on a radio.
We're going to turn it over to Q&A if anyone has any questions.
So there's been recently disappearances of scientists, one of which actually supposedly committed suicide. His name is David Wilcock. He made a film called Above Majestic, wherein they talked about alleged labs in the Arctic that were made for cloning. Supposedly Germany had been involved in this. This dates back to as early, I believe, as World War II. Do you have any knowledge of these bases? And if anything, what do these Arctic bases play in the role of our current deterrence?
Is that an American question or a Canadian question?
I mean, it could apply to both, but whoever feels like addressing this, if possible. I don't know if this is even.
Well, I could tell you that the CFS alert doesn't do that. That's for sure. And the northern operational hubs are intended for us to be able to reach the areas that we need to reach. To access awareness, to increase the domain awareness that I spoke of earlier. I don't know anything about any cloning, that's for sure.
Yeah, and my knowledge of Russian bases in the Arctic is that they were basically conventional or nuclear military bases. Some of them powered with small nuclear reactors, which may be a way to go for future infrastructure development in the U.S. and Canadian Arctic, and. German bases or stations in Greenland during World War II were primarily focused on weather and communications, and I don't know if they were pursuing other technologies there.
The U.S. they had a nuclear hub, Patufic Space Base. Yeah. So they still do some missile warning, missile tracking out there. That's part of the debate is whether they need to staff up more or not. So that's current conversation, I think, right now.
Nothing? Did we exhaust everybody? Yeah, it could be.
That or they're all it's a Canadian audience and they're too polite to be asking questions. Is that what it is?
I've got a question. So Canada just made a large investment in the north with some new bases, some new infrastructure. Has that registered here in the U.S.? Do you think that's been heard? Does that seem meaningful? Does that seem sufficient?
Best for you to answer that, and then I can tell you my perspective.
Yeah, I think so. the Canadian investment in additional infrastructure in the Arctic, I think the dual-use nature of it is actually the right way to go. I think that one of the understandable criticisms of U.S. bases, in other parts of the world, has been that they tend to exclude local communities from benefiting from the features of that base. And the Canadian model that they're using now is specifically dual use in nature, so it does benefit the local communities and, for lack of a better word, enlist them in being part of the security and stability architecture of their own country. I think of one possible analogy is, in Europe, Greece considers itself and its citizens like a line of defense against, the jihadist hordes to the east. And the citizens kind of take that very seriously. And one of the reasons that Greece is actually more effective than many other countries in Europe in stemming the migrant flow is because their population understands that this is, kind of a civilizational threat. And so I think that dual-use basing and enlisting local and indigenous communities is absolutely the right way to go, and it's a lesson that the U.S. can learn and apply as well.
I think it's especially important when you look at the tyranny of distance and logistics. I don't think people constantly underplay or ignore what it takes to project force or to defend one's homeland. They take roads and railroads and air traffic kind of for granted, and when you build, as you cited, these bases in generally otherwise inaccessible areas, that's a big benefit not only to the surrounding communities but also to the joint defense. And I should say that it certainly shows the way it should be done versus what we saw in Great Britain, where Prime Minister Starmer declared rural internet to be part of England's 1.5% contribution to the 5%, right? So, you're 3.5% and then 1.5% is infrastructure. I'm thinking, come on, really? Rural internet is now going to be part of defense? So, props to Canada for not trying to have that fiction.
I don't know. Communications is key.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
I could tackle some of that stuff, I think, because Eric, you might be actually, you know what, I'm going to give it to you because you are Arctic foreign policy guy.
Sure. So some examples I mentioned earlier, sort of extending a runway for fighter aircraft, for cargo aircraft, but also for civilian aircraft. So you bring in more cargo. As you build a base, you may also need to upgrade the electrical grid, the waste grid. And so those things are also, again, to benefit the local community. Those are just some examples, but those are kind of the types of dual-use things that we're talking about.
Yeah, in communities, in Canada's Arctic communities, of which there aren't many, that's the only way that a military can actually sustain itself is by depending upon and relying on the knowledge base and the experience of those who actually live there permanently. And to set yourself up in a spot that's austere without support from local community knowledge and the capacity, the capabilities that we were just talking about earlier, I think that's almost a recipe for disaster because you're not going to be persistent. The only way to be persistent is actually to sit and to be with those local communities who are there. And so there's absolute dual use benefits to those communities because they get to reinforce their infrastructure, they get better quality infrastructure, they get better runways, they get better access to stuff that comes from abroad as well. And then of course power requirements for us as well, right? Persistent power requirement when you're talking about SMRs or maybe even MMRs. If you've got remote sensing locations, things like that, a lot of that technology has duplicative benefit to society.
I mean, two other things too, right? The access to medical care, and any sort of commissary that would be expanded or available.
Medical care, food service, and also repair capabilities for any stuff that you bring in to a crazily remote location. You need to plan for it to break. And when it breaks, you either need to have the competence, the parts to fix it there, or you have to take it back to wherever you brought it from to get it fixed. So bringing in repair capabilities that generally have multiple uses, right? A diesel mechanic is just as good on a truck as he or she may be on a military vehicle. That type of capability and competency typically gained from the local community is also of a benefit.
Here. The tangible benefits of a military to learn from the local communities is equally as beneficial the other way around. So our communities in the north, they know what it's like, and well, we don't, right? Well, I mean, sorry. Yeah, that's exactly where I was just going to head. So the Canadian Rangers, use of a different terminology from the United States in the military, but the Canadian Rangers is a component of Canada's reserve force, and they are considered locals, right? They're people who live locally in local communities across. They're more observers, actually, is what they are. So they're really high quality eyes and ears who have certain elements of security clearances that you were talking about earlier, and they live off the land. A lot of them are indigenous populations as well who live in these communities, and so they understand exactly how to live in the neighborhoods, live in the Arctic, how to get out, disappear for 3 to 4 weeks on the ice, and come back with no harm done whatsoever, just living normally. And they also then are equipped with radios and equipped with what they need to be able to report back and observe on anything that they've seen, activities that they've seen in Canada's north. So another great dual-use application that's more human in nature.
It's pretty amazing because I think in Greenland we shut down Community Day basis for the local communities.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us. My name is Bella if you need to find me, but thank you again. Have a good day.